This is Jacob Friedman.
Okay, so when you first saw the headlines about Canada responding to Donald Trump over Venezuela, it probably sounded like just another diplomatic flare-up, another round of outrage, another round of statements, another foreign policy spat that feels far away from daily life. But that surface story misses what actually made this moment so unsettling, especially for Canada. This wasn't about a disagreement over Venezuela. It wasn't even about Latin America. It was about the moment Canada realized that the assumptions it has lived under for decades may no longer protect it. What changed wasn't tone or temperament. It was logic. Canada wasn't reacting to bluster. It was reacting to a framework, a way of thinking about power that suddenly became explicit, unapologetic, and normalized by a U.S. president. And once you see that this stops being a regional crisis and starts looking like a warning flare, here's what officially happened, stripped down to the basics. Donald Trump escalated U.S. action toward Venezuela in a dramatic and highly public way. Capture of its president and declaring that the United States would effectively take control of Venezuela's affairs, he framed the move not as a limited intervention or a reluctant step toward stability, but as a rightful assertion of American authority in the Western Hemisphere. When he addressed the situation publicly, the emphasis wasn't on international law, democratic legitimacy, or multilateral cooperation. It was on power, dominance, and entitlement. For many Americans, this may have sounded familiar, even nostalgic. A strong America, a decisive America, a country that no longer asks permission. But in Ottawa, that press conference landed very differently. Canadian officials weren't parsing the details of Venezuela's internal politics. They were listening to the rationale. They heard a U.S. president openly signaling that sovereignty is conditional, that borders are negotiable, and that consent matters less than strength. That's the part most coverage skipped over. The danger here isn't just what Trump did, it's how he justified it. He invoked old doctrines of hemispheric dominance that many people assumed had been relegated to history books. He spoke as if the idea that the United States has an unquestionable right to control its sphere had never really gone away, only been waiting for someone willing to say it out loud again. From Canada's perspective, that matters enormously. Canada isn't a distant bystander watching events unfold on another continent. It is a resource-rich democracy that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. When a U.S. president starts normalizing expansionist language and collateral action abroad, Canada understands that it's not just observing global politics, it's watching precedent being set. For decades, Canadians operated under a quiet confidence that whatever turbulence existed elsewhere, certain fundamentals were stable. The United States, whatever its flaws, was predictable, bound by norms, restrained by alliances and institutions. That confidence is what cracked here, because if borders, sovereignty, and consent are optional when power is sufficient, then no relationship is immune from reassessment. This is why Venezuela hit differently, not as an isolated crisis, but as a signal. Test case, a demonstration of how far a U.S. president is willing to go and how casually he is willing to redefine the rules. Canadian policymakers recognize something unsettling in real time. Once domination is normalized somewhere, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads through language first, through expectations next, and eventually through action. And that recognition is what set off Canada's shift. Not panic, not theatrics, but anger mixed with resolve. The understanding that history doesn't usually announce itself with one catastrophic moment. It erodes certainty gradually through normalization, intimidation, and silence. Canada decided it would not be silent. For years, Canadians could afford to treat Trump's rhetoric as noise, jokes about annexation, about Canada becoming the 51st state, about borders that were more suggestion than reality. They were dismissed as trolling, as provocation designed for cable news and social media outrage. Even when the language was repeated, many assumed it was performative. That assumption is gone now. What changed is not that Trump said something outrageous, it's that he paired that language with action and justification in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Canadian security analysts no longer treat this kind of rhetoric as entertainment. They treat it the way they treat military exercises, economic threats, or coercive diplomacy, as signals of intent when a leader repeatedly names countries he believes should be absorbed, dominated, or controlled. Canada assumes those statements are deliberate, not accidental, not jokes, signals. And when those signals are reinforced by real-world actions like what just happened in Venezuela, the stakes shift dramatically. There's a historical reason for that sensitivity. Canada has studied what happens when powerful states begin redefining borders and legitimacy on their own terms. It rarely starts with tanks crossing borders. It starts with language, with doctrines being dusted off and reframed as common sense, with the idea that rules are optional if you're strong enough. History shows how quickly that logic spreads once it's accepted anywhere. That's why the reference to old hemispheric doctrines mattered so much in Ottawa. These weren't abstract theories. They were reminders of a worldview in which sovereignty is conditional and smaller nations exist at the pleasure of larger ones. For decades, many believed those ideas had been superseded by international law, by multilateral institutions, by a shared understanding that restraint was in everyone's interest. What Canada heard in Trump's remarks was a rejection of that entire framework. And once you hear that, you can't unhear it, because Canada isn't just any neighbor. It's deeply integrated with the United States economically, militarily, and culturally. It relies on shared assumptions about predictability and good faith. When those assumptions begin to crack, everything built on top of them feels suddenly fragile. This is where the story diverges from the caricature of overreaction. Canada isn't responding with viral threats or chest-thumping speeches. There are no dramatic ultimatums. What's happening instead is quiet. And more consequential, Canada is reassessing its dependencies, its military readiness, its supply chains, its assumptions about deterrence. It's studying modern conflicts, especially Ukraine, where asymmetrical warfare, drones, civilian resilience, and rapid mobilization have changed what defense actually looks like. This isn't fear, it's realism. Canada isn't trying to provoke Trump. It's trying to ensure it's never caught unprepared by him. That distinction matters. Preparing quietly is very different from posturing publicly. It reflects an understanding that strength isn't just about aggression, it's about resilience. At the same time, Canada is doubling down on something Trump openly mocks: alliances. While Trump dismisses international institutions and frames cooperation as weakness, Canada is strengthening ties. With Europe reinforcing NATO commitments and coordinating closely with democratic partners, the logic is straightforward. Power exercised alone burns through influence quickly. Power embedded in legitimacy and cooperation lasts. This is also where the media framing falls apart. Too much coverage treats this as a personality clash or a diplomatic spat, focusing on tone instead of substance. But the real story isn't about Trump being rude or provocative. It's about a worldview that treats nations as assets and populations as obstacles, a transactional approach to power that history tells us doesn't stop once it succeeds once. And that's why Venezuela matters to Canada, not because of geography, but because of precedent. Because once domination is justified as policy, the question isn't who's next geographically, it's who's vulnerable structurally, who depends on assumptions that no longer hold. And Canada has realized that it can no longer rely on the idea that shared history alone will protect it. For a long time, Latin America occupied a strange place in the Canadian imagination. Important, yes. Complex, yes, but distant. Not something most Canadians saw as directly tied to their own security or sovereignty. That distance made it easy to view U.S. actions in the region as unfortunate but contained. What this moment shattered was that sense of insulation. Canada now sees Venezuela not as a separate theater, but as a proving ground, a place where a U.S. president can test how much resistance exists and how quickly the world responds. From Ottawa's perspective, what's most alarming isn't just the action itself, but the absence of constraints around it. There is no sustained emphasis on democratic agency, no patience for multilateral process, no consistent respect for international legitimacy. The language keeps circling back to leverage, resources, and control. That framing is an accidental. It reflects a deeper ideological shift toward transactional power politics, where relationships are evaluated purely on what can be extracted from them. This is where Canada's anger comes into focus, because Canadians recognize this pattern. They've seen how sovereignty is rarely lost in a single dramatic rupture. It erodes through normalization, through repeated suggestions that independence is conditional, through the quiet acceptance of intimidation as just another negotiating tactic. When that erosion goes unchallenged, it becomes permanent. That's why even rhetoric that once felt absurd is now taken seriously. References to annexation are no longer dismissed as trolling. They are logged, analyzed, and weighed alongside other indicators, not because Canada expects an invasion tomorrow, but because responsible governments plan based on capability and intent, not vibes, and this shift has concrete consequences. Canada is reviewing military dependence. Tendencies that once felt untouchable, it's questioning whether supply chains built on trust can withstand political volatility. It's reassessing economic exposure to a neighbor whose leadership has signaled a willingness to weaponize interdependence. These are not abstract exercises. They shape budgets, procurement decisions, and long-term strategy. There's also a cultural reckoning happening beneath the policy discussions. Canadians are being forced to confront how much of their national security rested on assumptions rather than guarantees. The idea that shared democratic values would always override raw power, the belief that proximity ensured protection. Those beliefs weren't foolish, they were rational in a different era, but eras change. What makes this moment especially fraught is that it's happening in plain sight. Trump isn't hiding his worldview. He's articulating it openly. He's reviving language that treats influence as entitlement and dominance as virtue, and that openness removes any plausible deniability. Canada isn't guessing at intentions, it's listening. This is also why the response hasn't been loud. Loud responses escalate quickly and trap countries into performative cycles. Canada's approach reflects an understanding that durability matters more than theatrics. Quiet coordination with European partners, serious engagement within NATO, learning from countries that have had to adapt quickly to new forms of coercion and hybrid conflict. That's where the real work is happening. And while Trump frames alliances as burdens, Canada sees them as insulation, not against disagreement, but against isolation. History shows that countries acting outside shared rules may feel powerful in the short term, but they burn through trust rapidly. Once that trust is gone, even allies start planning for worst-case scenarios. That's the environment Canada believes it's entering now. The unsettling truth is that none of this feels hypothetical anymore. The warning signs are no longer abstract. They're embedded in speeches and policy moves in the casual way domination is discussed. And when a leader shows you how he thinks about power, responsible governments believe him. Canada believes him. And that belief is reshaping how it understands its own future. What's striking is how little of this deeper shift is reflected in the way the story is usually told. Much of the media coverage reduces Canada's response to tone, to emotion, to whether officials sound angry or calm, but anger isn't the story here. Preparation is, and preparation doesn't make for flashy headlines. Behind the scenes, Canada is doing what states do when they realize the ground rules may be changing. It's stress testing assumptions that once felt permanent, assumptions about allies always acting in good faith, assumptions about trade remaining insulated from political coercion, assumptions about security guarantees being immune to the whims of individual leaders. When those assumptions are no longer safe, prudence looks like skepticism. And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, especially for Americans who still want to believe this is just about Trump's personality, because the real issue isn't temperament, it's institutional erosion. It's what happens when a leader uses the language of domination and finds that there are few meaningful constraints pushing back. When that language is rewarded domestically, it doesn't disappear, it hardens. Canada understands something Trump openly. Power that operates without legitimacy eventually collapses under its own weight. It provokes resistance. It forces neighbors to hedge, diversify, and prepare for worst-case scenarios. That's not anti-Americanism, that's realism. Canada isn't trying to undermine the United States. It's trying to survive uncertainty created by U.S. leadership choices. And that brings us back to Venezuela, because Venezuela isn't just about foreign policy. It's about precedent, about whether unilateral action framed as dominance becomes acceptable again, about whether the language of control replaces the language of consent. Once that shift happens, every relationship becomes conditional. Loyalty is measured by compliance. Independence becomes defiance. This has real implications for ordinary people, even if it doesn't feel that way yet. When governments prepare for instability, resources shift, budgets change, priorities harden, trade becomes more cautious, travel becomes more complicated, cultural exchange becomes more strained. The costs of uncertainty are diffuse, but they're real. They show up gradually in higher prices, in fewer guarantees, in a more brittle sense of safety. Canada's response reflects an understanding that waiting for clarity is itself a risk. By the time intentions are undeniable, options have already narrowed. That's why preparation happens early, quietly, and often without public drama. It's also why this moment feels like a line being crossed, even if no single action looks catastrophic on its own. What's missing from much of the conversation is the obvious question: if this is how power is justified abroad today, how will it be justified tomorrow, and against whom? Once the logic of dominance is normalized, restraint becomes the anomaly. Canada is refusing to assume restraint will automatically reappear. Instead, it's placing its bets on endurance, on alliances that outlast individual leaders, on institutions that still believe rules matter, on the idea that legitimacy, while slower and messier than brute force, creates stability that domination never can. That choice doesn't make Canada dramatic. It makes Canada serious, and seriousness is often misread as quiet until it's suddenly obvious that the country paying attention early was the one that understood what was coming. There's also a reason this moment feels emotionally charged in Canada in a way that's hard to translate elsewhere. Canadians are used to living next to power without being consumed by it. The relationship with the United States has always required balance, trust, and a shared commitment to restraint. When that commitment starts to wobble, it doesn't just raise policy questions, it touches identity. It forces a country to ask whether proximity is still a source of safety or a potential liability. That's why the response hasn't been about matching rhetoric with rhetoric. Canada isn't interested in theatrical confrontation. It's interested in not being coerced, and coercion doesn't always arrive with tanks. It arrives through economic pressure, through legal ambiguity, through the steady suggestion that resistance is futile or unreasonable. Canada recognizes that pattern precisely because it's watched it play out elsewhere. This is also why Canada's reaction isn't framed as panic. Panic is reactive. This is deliberate. It's a recognition that the erosion of democratic norms abroad and at home often move in parallel. When courts, legislatures, and the press are weakened domestically, international commitments become easier to discard. The same impulse drives both. For ordinary Canadians, this still feels abstract. Most people aren't waking up worried about hemispheric doctrines. They're thinking about jobs, healthcare, housing, and family. But geopolitics has a way of seeping into everyday life slowly, then all at once. When trust erodes between countries, costs rise. When trade becomes weaponized, prices shift. When security assumptions change, public spending follows. Canada is trying to get ahead of that curve, to absorb the shock gradually rather than all at once, to build resilience before it's urgently needed. That's not hostility, it's prudence. And here's the part that's easy to miss if you're only watching this through the lens of outrage. Canada isn't rejecting the United States. It's rejecting a worldview that says might makes right, that consent is optional, and that rules exist only for the weak. Canada is choosing to align itself with countries that still believe stability comes from cooperation, not coercion. That choice may not feel dramatic now, but over time it shapes everything from defense planning to economic strategy to cultural identity. It determines whether a country feels secure enough to invest in openness or pressured into defensiveness. Canada is choosing openness with guardrails, engagement with preparation. And that brings us to the bluntness of Canada's message. Even when delivered calmly, Canada will not be absorbed. It will not be intimidated. It will not quietly accommodate threats to its sovereignty. Those aren't slogans. They're conclusions drawn from history. The era of assuming good faith is over, not because Canadians want conflict, but because ignoring warning signs has never prevented it. The countries that endure are the ones that pay attention early, ask uncomfortable questions, and prepare before preparation feels urgent. Canada is doing exactly that, and that leaves us with the part of this story that's hardest to sit with, especially if you're watching from the United States. Canada isn't overreacting. It's adapting. It's responding to what it sees, not to what it hopes will be true. When leaders show you how they understand power, responsible neighbors take them at their word. They don't psychoanalyze. They don't reassure themselves with nostalgia. They plan. What makes this moment so clarifying is how calm Canada's posture actually is. There's no hysteria here, no breathless countdowns, just a steady recognition that the political era Canada assumed it was living and may already be ending. And when eras end, the countries that fare best are the ones that notice the shift early before the rules fully collapse. This is why the closing message from Canada matters. It isn't performative defiance, it's resolve. Canada is saying it will continue to build alliances, continue to invest in legitimacy, continue to orient its economy and security around durability rather than domination. That's not a rejection of power. It's a different understanding of it. Power that lasts versus power that intimidates, power that attracts versus power that coerces. And there's a lesson here that goes beyond Canada. When leaders normalize the language of control, the consequences ripple outward in ways that are easy to dismiss at first. They make neighbors nervous. They push allies to hedge. They encourage smaller states to prepare for worst-case scenarios rather than best intentions. Over time, that reshapes the global landscape into something colder, more brittle, and far less forgiving. The tragedy is that none of this is inevitable. It's the result of choices of a worldview that sees restraint as weakness and cooperation as humiliation, of political incentives that reward spectacle over stability. Canada is responding not because it wants confrontation, but because it recognizes that pretending not to notice doesn't preserve peace, it just delays reckoning. So when you hear Canada's message to Donald Trump, don't mistake its calm for softness. Calm is what confidence sounds like when it's grounded in preparation. Canada isn't reacting to headlines, it's reacting to history, to patterns it's seen before, to language that has consequences, whether people want to admit it or not. The question this moment leaves us with isn't just about Canada or Venezuela. It's about how many countries are quietly reassessing the same assumptions right now, how many are preparing without saying much, how many are learning to live in a world where rules feel less stable and power feels more personal. If you're watching this unfold, the most important thing you can do is pay attention to the logic, not the drama. Ask who benefits when domination is framed as strength. Ask what kind of world this language creates if it goes unchallenged, because moments like this don't announce themselves as turning points until long after they've passed. They look ordinary at first, another speech, another crisis, another headline you scroll past, and then one day you realize the assumptions you were living under are gone. That's what Canada saw here, and that's why it's ready.